There we go. We're just at the top of the hour, and welcome everybody to another Good Governance Academy event. And today, of course, it's a very special event in our collaboration with BDI, the GCC BDI, the Board Directors Institute. For those of you who haven't yet attended a Good Governance Academy webinar, we really have conversations and we try to keep the audience very much involved. Please, we have got the chat open. We have got the reactions open. So if you like what we're saying, thumbs up, give us a heart emoji. It'll be lovely. I see Karina is online, so that's great. Yes, welcome everybody. And I'd like to now hand over to John, who's the CEO of the GCC Board Directors Institute. John, welcome to a Good Governance Academy event.
Yeah, thanks very much, Carolyn. And I know this is the second of 3 such webinars that we're running in partnership with the Good Governance Academy. And at GCC Board Directors Institute, we think it's very important to collaborate across markets. And while we represent the GCC, meaning the 6 economies in the Gulf, so that would be in order of size, thinking about it economically, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Kuwait, Oman, Bahrain, we always think it's very important to raise our heads above the parapet, clearly hear from other people in other jurisdictions, because with big topics like this, thinking about energy, ESG, and the new board agenda, it's very important to compare and contrast while recognizing, I think, the big opportunity that we have. Delighted to see Professor King. As soon as I saw the advertisements for this webinar coming out, I immediately signed up, and I'm sure that's the case with many people because, of course, he needs no introduction. I'll leave Carolyn to introduce our other wonderful speakers, Peder and Karina, and I'm sure they'll take us through our paces. And just 2 points to make. One is that we will be doing a 3rd webinar with Good Governance Academy, and that is on the 20th of November. And we'll be looking at the all-important subject of global supply chains. And being in the thick of it, geographically in the middle of many, many supply chains, again, I think that's a must attend for all of you. And I'll just leave Carolyn with this note that I picked up from the Financial Times recently, which is that US shareholders apparently failed to pass any environmental proposals in the most recent proxy season in the USA. So a big statement from the Financial Times, and I'm sure perhaps a good way to get the minds thinking. And we would encourage you, as I'm sure Carolyn will, to obviously ask questions, get involved, and you don't get a better panel discussion than this with this stellar speaker lineup. Thank you very much, Carolyn, and we appreciate the support of Good Governance Academy and look forward to a great discussion today.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, John. And with no further ado, I'd really like to welcome, as you said, Professor Mervyn King, who really is going to bring a governance angle to us, but also in a governance, from a governance perspective, is Karina. And Karina, looking at your profile, part of the Climate Governance Initiative, I think that's, and founding chair, we're really looking forward to hearing about that initiative and your drive behind that initiative, which is fabulous. And then Peder Duffy from the ESG Exchange. Welcome, Peder, and we're really looking forward to the practicalities of what the new board agenda means and the implementation of energy and ESG in practical terms. But ladies first, if you could perhaps just give us a little bit of a sense of, in each of you in turn, what this topic means for you, energy, ESG, and the new board agenda. If you can just give us a few insights to set the scene for us. Please, Karina, I'll start with you. And you are on mute if you didn't know.
Thank you. I didn't know whether you had to mute me or not. Thank you, everybody. I'm absolutely delighted to be here. So I have served on listed company boards for 12 years now. My first 9 years were on the board of the Italian oil and gas major Eni. But importantly, prior to that, my career was in the investment management industry. And not only that, it was the investment institutions that got together to nominate me for my first corporate board, Annie. Today, I'm on the board of Terna, which is the Italian grid operator. So adjacent, obviously, still in the energy industry, but obviously a completely different type of business, a state-controlled utility. I do want to say one or two words about the Climate Governance Initiative, which, as you note, Carolyn, I founded. This started literally 10 years ago on the eve of COP21 in Paris. The genesis of that initiative was really twofold. One, I wound up on the board of an oil major with a kind of mission to bring a sustainability perspective into the boardroom, and in particular, an understanding of the implications of the climate transition, which is a pretty tall order. And I discovered just how complex it is to do from within a boardroom. And then on the eve of COP21, I got a call from a group of institutions telling me that they were readying themselves to turn up to Paris and to press very vocally for board directors to be far more proactive on the question of climate transition and to deepen their skills. And, could I help? And so I gave the matter a lot of thought and ended up approaching the World Economic Forum to explore with them whether this was something that we could do together, which they thankfully agreed to do. And from this was born the Climate Governance Initiative, essentially a project that aims to assist and support board directors in understanding all the implications of the transition, which we define very holistically to include nature and circular economy and just transition. And of course, underlying all that is good governance and anti-corruption. So we have a very detailed program of training and support, and we have chapters all over the world. In the GCC region, we have one in the UAE that launched 2 years ago. And so, we're there to really assist and support directors who want to use their voice in the boardroom to be a force for constructive change on the strategy of the company. Thank you.
Karina, that's a great segue because I co-founded the establishment of one of your chapters in Southern Africa, Chapter 0 Southern Africa.
Correct.
And in fact, Prof. Mervyn King, Mervyn is a patron of Chapter 0 Southern Africa. So
wonderful.
Let me hand over to Mervyn now in terms of a brief oversight, a brief précis of your sense of the energy, ESG, and the board's new agenda.
Well, to all of you online, it is a huge intellectual exercise, to put it bluntly. And you've got to have an inclusive sort of policy approach to these issues because you need to know what regulators are thinking. So you actually need someone in your executive or board member to actually be in communication with the regulators to know what they're thinking. And then you've got to be very aware at the same time of the society in which you are steering a company to its ultimate goals that it wants to achieve. What is society's actual thinking of how you're balancing sustainability goals with political and economic realities? And it's the timing of these things. And then there's the financing of the transition. You've got many balls in the air at the same time. And that's why I started by saying it's a huge intellectual exercise and a very complicated one. The question of financing, of course, is different in the Southern Hemisphere from the Northern Hemisphere. In the Southern Hemisphere, we didn't start pollution. It started in the Northern Hemisphere. And unfortunately, in the Southern Hemisphere, we are still very fossil fuel driven when it comes to the supply of energy. And there are local constraints about employment, etc., on coal mines the closing of coal mines. And we have to think carefully about financing because of the debt burdens that South Africa, for example, in the Southern Hemisphere, is under. So we have at the moment an acknowledgement of responsibility from the Northern Hemisphere to try and help finance the Southern Hemisphere in this transition from fossil fuel energy to renewables. And just to give you a feel for it, as a director of a company in South Africa, you've got to appreciate that the estimate to change this in the next 15 to 25 years, and South Africa's vision is 25 years, it will cost $300 billion US. Where's that money going to come from? Well, in terms of the spirit of the Paris Agreement, a lot of that money should be coming from the north to the south. But the north is talking about loans, export credits, and not grants, which adds to a company's debt burden here in South Africa. And South Africa's approach to this, however, as chair of the G20, is that we want to show the world that we in South Africa are championing in the question of transition. But we are hamstrung from certain factual issues, namely gross unemployment. Secondly, we have got huge borrowings, state borrowings. And for the North to lend us more money in order to transition is not an answer. And so all that has to be considered. So you will see there are many balls in the air as we're going along, and things that we've had to think of as directors of companies in South Africa that we didn't apply our minds to before. And then there's all the geopolitical risks also now arising from the Trump administration's attitude towards tariffs, etc. So you've got turbulence there. And then you've got geopolitical turbulence from 3 wars, Gaza, Ukraine, and Sudan. And all of these are impacting on South Africa in one way or another. So as a director of a company in South Africa, you have to almost be a juggler, because just imagine you're going to make a decision about moving, let's say, to solar power, but your time is got to be absolutely spot on in regard to your borrowings and what financing you're going to get by way of grants from the north, not by way of borrowings or export credits. So it's a juggling act to try and get these all happening at the same time and having a positive effect on the company. And that's why I said it's a huge intellectual exercise. And I just want to add one other thing that we're juggling with, and that is we've got a rapid population growth. So we've got an increasing demand for energy. And so that I think by 2015, the earliest, we can say that we're no longer an emitter of pollution in the planet. We will be using, hopefully, clean coal. We will have to use nuclear. And it's going to take, I believe, 25 years. And if we don't get it right, we will be one of the biggest emitters in the Southern Hemisphere of pollution and carbon emissions. So I've painted a rather gloomy picture, but it's reality that you really have to juggle these things. And the question is timing this exactly to make decisions to move away from fossil fuel energy to, let's say, a nuclear or solar power, whatever it is. And then there's the question of the cost of all that. So, and you're strategizing at the same time to reach your ultimate goal you want the company to reach. So it is, and I end my comments, Carolyn, by saying a huge intellectual exercise.
Thank you so much. It's just incredible the way that we are seeing how these introductions are Peter, with Karina's introduction in terms of actually facing a problem as a director, taking that problem to an international body, a global body, developing the client governance initiative, and then seeing the national and international and regulatory environment from what Professor King is saying. Peter, from your perspective, energy, ESG, board agenda, how are you seeing that play out?
Thanks, Carolyn. I guess in the first instance, I asked myself, well, why are we here? Why are we having this conversation? Is it because there's a global movement towards being kinder to the planet and people less well off than ourselves across societies? And of course, as human beings, we'd be inclined towards those warm tendencies, but that's not why we're here. Why we're here is because the global capital markets, the pension funds in particular, are quite petrified as they look forward at a world growing in uncertainty. Petrified as to the adequacy of the tools and techniques that historically traditionally been used to understand risks, understand uncertainties. Because if you can't use tools, if they're not fit for purpose, you're going to find it difficult to determine where you're going to place your bets in your investees. So if you go back to the days of the G20 and G7 and what gave rise to the creation of, indeed, come back to the Financial Stability Board, and then arising out of that, the TCFD, that was really driven by the capital market saying, look, we need better tools to better understand, and we need a common way of talking about uncertainties. Now, fast forward to today, and clearly there are political headwinds from the US. We have massive simplification of the ESRS in Europe, and the apparentness never, apparently IFRS holding steady. But at the end of the day, when we look at those headwinds and the tendency, we've gone, the pendulum has swung from, greenwashing up to a decade ago, and even, 5, 6 years ago, 2, 3 years ago, where typical CSR reports, corporate social responsibility reports, if you were to believe them, coming largely from marketing departments and investor relations departments and so forth, they presented their companies, their entities, their preparers as, deeply green. And when you begin to look then at the emerging reports, you're looking at reports that largely reflect lighter shades of green. And you can see a situation where you could imagine if I was a risk advisor to a Global 2000 in particular, I'd be saying to them, on the assumption that you presented CSR reports that were deep green, and now you're heading to a lighter green, I'd be anticipating a Dear CEO letter, asking why is that? Because of course, when you could write something about yourself without fear of being looked at and scrutinized, you could say pretty much what you wanted to. But now we have these global standards, and the fact that they're now, when you produce your report, it is subject to scrutiny. So when we look at the headwinds, we're not seeing, nevertheless, any evidence of people going away from the application of standards. Why? Because notwithstanding people now getting a more in the frame mindset of whispering about green matters because they don't want to attract adverse attention from political sources, let us say, they nevertheless continue to ask questions. And today then, to Mervyn's point about this massive intellectual challenge, at the level of practical application, the day is gone when people need to be educated on why we are here. It's about the economy, stupid, I would say. It's about uncertainty and about needing better tools. The day is gone when people need to be educated as to what these standards require you to say, because that's been well publicized now. That pendulum now has moved into, given a shall statement with regards to governance, with regards to strategy, with regards to risk management, are the typical approaches to strategy, governance, management of enterprise-wide risks, are these fit for purpose today? Sadly, the answer is largely not really. And I guess the next questions as we go through this conversation, Carolyn, we'll begin to peel back the layers of why they're not, and maybe what indicators or what the pointers are for where, you know, improvements in strategy thinking, risk management and governance arrangements, the improvements that are beginning to emerge. But we're a long way yet, a long way away from international consensus as to what good looks like in terms of practical approaches to governance, strategy and risk management.
Thanks, Peter. And just to answer one of these questions in a nutshell, and from what you've said, you've actually answered it, but what is your view on the future of ESG?
Well, if that's a question to myself, I'll answer it by saying ESG, I think, is not a very helpful term. ESG is a classification system, effectively, of understanding all of the things in the E bucket, all of the things in the S bucket, and all of the things in the G bucket. They all have different taxonomies. They all have different units of measure. They all have different ways of measuring things. So ESG as a term really is about these data that by and large are available, but very hard to access. Sustainability, on the other hand, is the outcome. It's about the statement, the promise you're going to make with regards to your viability, your ability to perform in a sustainable way over the longer term, bearing in mind the E, S, and G topics you're reporting on using data that can be trusted. So ESG is the data, sustainability is the outcome. The future of it, it's not a trend thing. It's driven by the markets and this absolute requirement to better understand those organizations that are silent on these topics because they don't know what it is they need to do. And by and large, any entity that is silent on ESG today will be punished ultimately by its customers. And they're the types of companies that investors, I think, will slowly walk away from. Not overnight. There'll be a dimmer switch approach to winding down positions on companies that don't have a demonstrably credible story on ESG and sustainability, I would say.
Thanks, Peter. Karina, are you just on mute? But does that resonate with you?
Sorry. Yeah, I'd like to come in on that. I think that you're sitting in the boardroom and you're contending with the fact that, as Peter said, some of the language out there is becoming more muddled. And meanwhile, Mervyn is absolutely right that we as companies exist in a regulatory and political system at a national level, but also at an international level that is growing in complexity. And our job in the boardroom is to make practical decisions, right? And so what I see is that notwithstanding all of this stuff, which one company described as bluster, what's happening at a practical level is that, to use a really tired cliche, the train has left the station. I don't think anybody disputes now that we are if you take the issue of climate change, we are in a drastically warming world, and that has ripple effects across our natural systems, water stress, and also it has spillover effects on social dynamics like migration, and which in turn has triggered massive issues in the global north. So we who run companies have to navigate all that. We have to navigate that in a world of increasing political polarization, where policy decisions are taken that make it harder for us to operate. Somebody, I think I think it was Mervyn who cited the rise in protectionism. That makes it much harder to do business. So with that by way of context, most companies are carrying on. It's not like they're suddenly saying, well, somebody voted in people who denied the reality of physics, so physics is dead. I mean,
No
physics is physics, right? So the temperature is hotter. My house flooded last summer, and that's what we're dealing with. And whether it's my house or my factory, or we have to deal with that. So that by way of context, yes, the investors are getting a little bit more, in some cases, a lot more timid around these questions. John opened the discussion by noting that there hadn't been a single environmental resolution passed last year. That's a hell of a headline. Unfortunately, it doesn't really tell us very much, because environmental resolutions rarely pass with a majority. Very, very rarely. When they do pass, that is definitely news. What's news is that a lawsuit to dismiss it may have failed, because there are more and more of them to force those things off the ballot. And depending on who's in power, who controls the Securities and Exchange Commission in the United States, for example, such lawsuits may result in shutting down debate at the annual shareholder meetings. But what's meaningful is whether there's more or less than 10%. If there's more than 10%, I guarantee you, as board members, we view that as a very serious signal. If our shareholders are even filing a resolution, even if it gets kicked out, or if our peers are experiencing resolutions, even if they get dismissed by the courts, that's meaningful, okay? And we have to read those signals. So when Mervyn says, pay attention to what's happening around you, it's policy, but it's also civil society and the investor community and what they are expecting of us. So we carry on, and I think you had a lot of really smart questions for us that I hope we move to now, because I think we need to work through at a practical level what we in the boardroom can do in terms of organizing our committees, in terms of defining priorities that can help us navigate through these particularly stormy waters.
Well, there's no one better than Mervyn to talk to us about that, about really giving effect to this board imperative, and ensuring that it is embedded in the structures of the board, and of course then in the board's direction of the organization's strategy. So Mervyn, from your perspective, how should a board go about really bringing this, this thinking, these dilemmas into tangible results and action?
The answer is with difficulty. I think I ended when I was talking before Karina spoke, that it's almost a juggling act. And you actually need a corporate stakeholder relationship officer, because you have to learn and understand the needs, interests, and expectations of your various stakeholders. And unless you understand that, you can't make those decisions from a time point of view. Because when you think about it, we've moved away from the primacy of the shareholder to this value creation model in a sustainable manner. And we have to embed sustainability issues in the creation of value. And that has to be the thinking of the board. Now, it's fascinating to me that although the SEC in America, through its chair, Atkins, has made this statement that the IFRS should stop working on these, quote, specious matters, such as the sustainability standards, and focus only on financial statements. Well, the extraordinary thing is that in analyzing the S&P 500, the New York Stock Exchange, the NASDAQ, etc., I mean, research has shown that the makeup of the market cap of those companies, 80% of the makeup of that market cap, at least 80%, is not reflected in the financial statements, whether you're using US GAAP or you're using IASB standards. They are made up of what I'm going to call governance issues. They are made up of sustainability issues. The reality is that the Trump administration can do and have its effect on the SEC's chairman making the statement which he has made. But they can't move away or make it disappear the following fact: that business is at the junction of the economy, society, and the environment. We know that through the 20th century, there was a focus on making profit. But what we also know now is it was subsidized by society and the environment. And we just cannot allow that to continue. We could if we fail in our moral duty for those that come after us and fail in our absolute duty of good faith to the company, this incapacitated legal fiction of which we are the guardians. So that you cannot ignore these things, and you have to have sustainability uppermost in your mind in making those business judgment calls, because otherwise I don't think you act in the long-term best interest of the company.
Mm-hmm.
Because the reality that these things are happening, as Karina said, the planet is getting warmer, whether you like it or not.
Mm.
Glaciers are melting faster than ever before, whether you like it or not. There are bushfires happening, spreading around the world more than ever before. And there's turbulence in weather patterns. So whether you like it or not, that's the reality. And if boards don't take account of these factors in steering the company towards its ultimate goal and achieving that goal, then I think they're failing in their duty of care. And I go back to the UK doctrine of true and fair. And Peter, you may know that certainly in Ireland as well, you've got the true and fair doctrine that when you make a statement or you report, issue a corporate report, you've got to make sure it's true and fair. And that means that it's doesn't have misstatements, that you are faithfully believe that you are telling the truth, that it's actually factual, and there mustn't be any obfuscation. And you achieve those things. You can only achieve those things in today's world by taking account of those sustainability issues, which are embedded in creating value. So that's the reality. And the Trump administration, as powerful as it is, and he always says he's the most powerful man in the world, and I think he is, you can't get away from the facts which I've just been speaking about.
Thank you. So you've got a situation where it's your duty to integrate these factors into your strategy. But the approach to that, and Peter, I mean, you can treat it as a compliance requirement, and we're saying that compliance is getting, diluted in terms of compliance requirements. But we do need to have the duty of care to the company. We need to make sure that it's embedded. How do we go about doing that?
With great difficulty. I'm kind of minded at, this is my first time as CEO of an NGO. Before now, the previous, let's say, 40 years pretty much, I've been an advisor to many boards here in Ireland that were the subsidiary boards of US corporations that, you know, the European headquarters for massive operations across Europe, North Africa, Middle East, and so forth. And whether it's in the States or here or elsewhere, you get involved in these strategy away days, because let's bring it down from let's say 30,000 foot to maybe closer to 10,000. On those strategy away days, with a pretty rarefied group of people, typically, even large in number, but nevertheless rarefied from across the world, assumptions are made. Assumptions about the present and assumptions about the future. And these assumptions, when they're put to print within the context of a plan, become very hard to change. And they become very, very dangerous, particularly now, given pace of change. So I'm not losing my marbles here, Mervyn, but you could come out with a statement of saying, you know, strategy is dead, but long live strategy. So what do I mean by that? I'll tell you a little story. The last Iraq war, the American military, without doubt the best military in the world today and then, was losing to a far inferior opposing force, poorly equipped, super motivated. But the American military was equally super motivated. But they kept on losing, and something had to change. And the biggest single thing that had to change was an acknowledgement that the doctrine, the 20th century doctrine, was possibly no longer fit for purpose. The strategic mindset, the formulation of the strategy, the execution of the strategy, where decision-making would be made. So a person called General Stanley McChrystal, who wrote the book, Team of Teams, took some really, really big personal career, risky decisions, let us say. He took a very siloed, hierarchical command and control structure and brought all of these people literally together in large warehouses, where people who were different in uniform and designations and so forth had to work side by side. And his purpose was to move from silos to cross-functional teams. And perhaps the biggest single decision he made was that decision-making in a fast-moving, dynamic, fast-paced, far-away place, decisions had to be made not by the general or the senior staff officers, but optimally by decision makers closer to the information on the ground. And so he, in doing that, had to create a framework. And he first of all started with purpose. Either, you know, why are we here or what are we doing here? That kind of statement of purpose. Breaking that down a bit further then into each decision maker's role in making decisions and supporting a particular mission, his or her mission, right down to the smallest unit within a behemoth organization. But then also saying, we're going to change now from setting a plan and faithfully prosecuting that plan to always sensing and anticipating what's around the corner, because these guys are beating us. Always learning and always adapting to that learning. And always on cross collaboration. And they learned about themselves that effectively this behemoth organization was an ecosystem of ecosystems. That's what they learned. And they began to win. And then he wrote the book, Team of Teams. Now, at a very practical level, how do we apply that to an organization, a company that could be compared with a behemoth military machine? Because that's pretty much what it is. It's kind of hierarchical. It's very much command and control, even with 21st century digitalization and so forth, and access to information, drilling down into source data sets and so forth. But still, organizations or species require us almost to be hierarchical, command and control, different tribes and silos. So how do you apply that then in the context of energy, in the context of ESG, all those different topics? It starts off with, first and foremost, understanding impacts. Now, that's kind of, the GRI focus on impacts. Economists would talk about, instead of externalities, which ultimately somebody else pays for. They're either positive or negative. And when you begin to get a sense of impacts and externalities, and you write them down, the next challenge then is to reframe your statement of purpose relative to those impacts, those externalities. Because whether you like it or not, those impacts, those externalities, if they're not hitting your performance today, your cash, your P&L, your balance sheet today, they will tomorrow for sure, and your customers will pick up on it. You need to define your core purpose in the context of those impacts and externalities. And
Thanks, Peter.
then when we're doing that,
sorry,
Carolyn, let's move on to two other critical things. When we do that, that's the point then at which you begin to place your bets with regards to your transitions. Where do you have the opportunity to transition? Is it in the context of decarbonization? Is it circularity? Is it social impacts, and so forth? And at that point, then you can map out and understand the ecosystem that you operate in as an industry, as a company within an industry, as an industry within a sector, and so forth.
Thanks. Sorry, I interrupted. I was just, as you're talking, I was thinking, so Karina's been there. She set the principles, worked through the principles, and has been directing and on the board. So delegating, overseeing, demonstrating accountability. What is your sense in terms of what we're hearing now and what you've actually directed in your organizations?
Look, I think that on one level, nothing has changed because particularly in industries with a fairly long value generation cycle, it's different in tech where things might turn over every 2-3 years in terms of the latest technology. But in energy, you're looking at investments that have a 30-year life or more. So decisions that are taken have to stick. And there may be swings in what policymakers are pushing or what investors are pushing, but we kind of have to think carefully about the big decisions we're going to make, and then we stick to them, and then we have to defend them. And if there's a major disruption, such as the war in Ukraine, and suddenly there's a focus on energy security that is conditioned by the fact that a huge chunk of supply is now suddenly, crossed off, then obviously you have to jump and you have to adjust. But that's, in the grand scheme of things, if you think in terms of a 40-year, pathway, that's an unpleasant bump on the road, but it's not something that's going to cause you to change direction, right? And then I think what we need to also think about is that while the regulators have done their best, particularly in the European Union, but also in New Zealand, Canada, Australia, Singapore, lots and lots of countries, Turkey, I'm doing a big piece of work in Turkey right now. It's astonishing to me how thorough and comprehensive the Turkish regulatory reforms have been. It is a significant driver to how corporates behave, and therefore how boards have to monitor and stay on top of these things. But it's always a baseline. It's not what defines what a company does. What defines what a company does is what is in the ultimate long-term best interests of the company, meaning its investors and its other stakeholders. So as long as you're guided by that fundamental principle, complying with rules that may be becoming more and more stringent is a must. it's necessary but not sufficient. And we have a question or a comment in the chat.
Yes.
About CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment System, or Carbon Border Adjustment mechanism, which has obviously raised a lot of eyebrows in a lot of places. As I'm sure many of you know, the reason CBAM was introduced was because large energy intensive companies in the EU were facing carbon leakage. In other words, they were being subject to ever more onerous carbon pricing pressures, and it became economically competitive to shut down and import from countries that didn't have such carbon pricing. So it was necessary to equalize that. Now, what's so interesting to see is the impact that CBAM is having in countries that have a large share of import dependence, or rather export dependence into the EU. They have two choices. Either they swallow the cost of the CBAM tariffs, or they introduce their own carbon pricing, which was exactly the goal. And so it's effectively Brussels is succeeding and exporting its regulatory model in a way that is actively seeking to use a term of art, internalize externalities, right? To prevent leakage and make sure that everybody pays the same price for carbon. That's a good thing, even though it can be a painful thing in adjusting to a new way of pricing.
The short term.
Right, exactly. So to get to your question, compliance, yes, absolutely, but it's compliance and we in the boardroom have to think, all right, so where does this fit into our strategy? Is our business model fundamentally consistent with a low and ultimately no carbon world, zero carbon world? If it isn't, if our core product is a huge emitter of carbon, whether in production or in its use, then we have a problem. Then we have to think about changing our business model. This is exactly what I experienced in my oil and gas company. That was the decision we had to make. And we made a decision that was to say, we're going to change our business model. We're going to start immediately. It's going to take 30 years, right? It's not something that you can do overnight. And while that 30-year transformation occurs, we have to continue to pay dividends, do share buybacks, pay our workers, fund all of the social investment that we commit to funding when we go into a country, schools and hospitals and roads and, educational programs that can't stop, right? So it is a big load to shoulder, but it's with a view to shifting the course of the supertanker, and most importantly, not making investment decisions today that are going to lock us into a production profile that is going to result in stranded assets, by which I mean assets that have lost their value and have to be written down because we're producing a product that nobody wants to buy anymore. So, for example, renewable energy has now exceeded, in terms of volume, coal in the world. It happened today. I saw the headline. It's cheaper than fossil energy. Now, for plants that are already built and there are some costs, it's cheaper to continue operating them. But nobody should be building any new fossil power generation facilities anymore. It doesn't make sense. It's cheaper to build clean energy and to build battery power alongside it to deal with the intermittency problem, and to build much more limited backup power in the form of some gas, and of course nuclear. And I agree with, I think it was Mervyn who said that we're going to have to invest heavily in nuclear. I respectfully disagree on clean coal. I think that is frankly an inefficient use of our very limited carbon capture and storage capacity. We don't have a lot of those cavities that we can use, not enough to absorb all the coal we have in the world. And we really need to use it for those hard to abate sectors. Power generation is not a hard to abate sector. We have substitution opportunities. But, if you're trying to do airline fuel, that's a much more difficult one. So there's some sustainable aviation fuel, but nothing like the supplies of feedstocks that we need. So CCS is going to be required for that, for pulp and paper, for some chemicals, for cement, for steel, until such time as we can get on track those cleaner technologies. So look, the International Energy Agency has thought this through very carefully. They are, I know, some of their recommendations can be quite controversial, but there's a lot that can be learned from the extremely comprehensive modeling that they do, and that is updated every year. And I think we should do the best we can with the data that we have.
Thanks, Karina. I've got a question here from Nazar, and perhaps Mervyn, I can put it to you. As boards navigate the energy transition and increasing ESG pressures, how can they move beyond compliance, as we've been speaking, and beyond compliance and disclosure to truly embed sustainability and resilience in the core strategy, especially when short-term financial pressures seem to conflict with long-term ESG commitments? Can you give us some insights there, please?
A mouthful. But the answer, I think, is back again to the duty of care to the company. You just can't ignore these things. It's all very well complying with the regulation, but you've got to make sure that you're discharging your duty of care to the company. And that means that you've accepted you're a guardian, a steward of the company's assets and its business affairs. And therefore, you've got to make decisions in the long-term best interest of the health of the company, and not a particular stakeholder or anything. So a regulator may lay down something which is the law, so it's mandated, so you have to comply with it. But that doesn't mean once you comply with it, that's it. Stop thinking about how you steer.
It's the and, as you said.
You've got to steer the company towards its ultimate goal, and you've got to do it in a sustainable manner in our world, which unfortunately we've had the use of natural assets faster than nature's regenerating them, for example. Just one example of a problem in which we all operate in today. So we're back again to the duty of good faith and acting in the best long-term interest of the health of the company. So just, mindless compliance, Kerry, with the regulators' mandated requirements doesn't mean you've discharged your duty of care to the company. You've got to apply your mind what is needed to actually discharge that duty of care on a true and fair basis using the UK measurement.
Thank you. So and thanks for answering the question. We've got strategy, we've got the applying your mind, the duty of care, all of the mechanisms, Karina, that you've mentioned. Just touching on, Peter touched on risk. And I know that that's your background, Peter, the risk manager, because what you're saying is, in terms of the agility required, is it's no longer these, the red, amber, green, 2D spreadsheets, with the boxes, the traditional risk management. And what you're talking about, Peter, when you mentioned that, that you have to be responsive, really talking about almost an agile response to it. Can you just expand a little bit more on that for us, please?
Sure. Well, there's a thing, in the context of, well, let's just go back to TCFD, 3 recommendations on risk management. That's the parent, as it were, of multiple, shall statements across IFRS and elsewhere. Okay, cool. The assumption is that we're now at the 10,000 foot level of risk management at a functional kind of systems level. So the assumption is that there is an organization's an enterprise management system, but there's no evidence of that existing other than in exceptional cases. There's consistent reports from, for example, in the States, from North Carolina State University's annual report. And by and large, in most organizations, what you have is you have a management system for compliance, for safety, for environment, for this, that, and the other. They're not talking to each other. Yet you have the illusion of being able to aggregate up information to an enterprise-wide view. So if you ask me the question, are existing risk management systems capable of addressing this fast-moving space that we're now in the context of energy and all of the other topics within the E-bucket, just that E-bucket alone, all with different taxonomies and units of measure? The short, easy, safe answer is no. Those existing traditional systems tend to talk in terms of stuff that's insurable or red, amber, green, but they also talk in terms of recent history being an indicator of what's going to happen tomorrow. And that doesn't work here because you have to shift your mind from being a kind of almost self-contained company in an industry, in a sector, to one that is itself an ecosystem, operating within an ecosystem. I mean, most companies don't have end-to-end visibility of their tier one suppliers. So they talk instead then of their critical tier one suppliers. And let's talk equally in the context of value chain actors and so forth. So what the requirement, and it goes back to the team of teams thing as well, but it's the mindset, that the mindset change effect required in the context of risk management, which is one of more being sensing and adapting and responding to what's around the corner. Because what happened yesterday is not even a proxy, certainly not a proxy. It's not even an indicator of what might happen tomorrow. So shortening the decision-making levels from the boardroom to the storeroom. If we talk about governance, governance is now something that's practiced just in the boardroom. There is a thread of governance that has to go from those strategic leaderships down to the junior leaderships at the operational and tactical levels. And what you have in terms of your frameworks and your policies and controls have to manifest in the form of day-to-day decisions that people make, either with regards to upside risk, what the opportunities are, or managing downside risk where you're into the cost control and compliance spaces. So existing risk systems are not quite, sadly, fit for purpose, and something that I'm addressing with other experts in the ISO kind of space and elsewhere. But one last little point on the context of risk. As we're now in the 21st kind of digital age, a great thing, you know, there's this always the tension between the board and management typically. You know, the board is required to be nosy, but can't get its hand in, can't cross that line into management. And when you receive the 500-page advanced papers on something like Diligent, the great thing now is that you can drill down into data sets. And I would advocate a very practical kind of risk management approach. One of just, it goes by, tell me, show me, prove it to me. By and large, at that corporate level, the top levels in organizations, you're going to have beautiful frameworks and policy statements, even controlled frameworks. And you've asked people then, that's the tell me piece, 9 out of 10. 9 out of 10. Come down into show me. Show me the procedures that are following from this particular, the children of the policy statement. Prove to me that this number over here, a target, or journey towards the target, or deviation from the pathway to the target, prove to me right down to the data that we're on track. And don't show me a PowerPoint. Don't show me a PDF. At a board level, I at least need to drill down into a data set. And I accept that management will drill into the data set. But in this day and age, that is the kind of tooling that you need to have in place. But be aware, if you don't in the first instance have an enterprise-wide capability at a systems level, ability to understand your risks, aggregate them up, and drill down into data sets, quite frankly, you're playing with illusions and so forth. And that is the type of thing that will result in litigation and punishment in the form of fines and so forth, because that's the next phase of the journey that we're all on in this whole area of governance, risk.
Thanks, Peter.
And strategy.
I'm going to give Karina the last word because we have run out of time, but really taking that and building on what we've said around the best interests of the company, the effective risk management, and really looking, Karina, into the building trust in your organization, that your organization is going to do their best. Have you got any thoughts on that?
Building trust is obviously a much broader topic.
Yes.
Just risk management.
No. Yes.
Look, I think that building trust is something that the company needs to do vis-a-vis the system in which it operates, right? So the stakeholders, the employees, the members of the community, the supplier base, and of course the investors need to really trust that the company is behaving in a principled and also transparent manner. And so I think that it starts with the leadership in the boardroom and the chair of the board demonstrating that, modeling that to fellow members of the board, creating an environment of mutual trust. But it also radiates out to the management and to the whole of the staff. One of the things that I personally made a point of doing, and we had limited opportunities to engage with staff because that was something that the company controlled very, very tightly. But nevertheless, when there was the occasional dinner or buffet lunch or something like that, I personally would make a point of introducing myself, asking questions, and really using it as an opportunity to listen. Some boards, by the way, designate a member of the board to be their liaison with employees, which I think is such a brilliant idea. It's not a widespread practice, but I do think that it's something that helps convey to the staff that the board is there to serve them. When I was an employee and I was a member of the ethics committee, I had one of the department heads come to me and say, or it wasn't a department head, it was a deputy department head who came to me and said, the head of my department he was a whistleblower, basically. He said, the head of my department is doing something illicit. I don't know who to turn to, I'm telling you. I went straight to the chair of the audit committee to say, I don't know what to do with this, but I'm hoping that this will be useful information for you. And he said, it actually is, because we've had lots of pieces of the puzzle and this is helping bring it together. And the next day that person was fired. And it was the number 3 in the company. So the fact that this person trusted me enough as a member of the ethics committee to share something that he really worried him, and that I trusted the chair of the audit committee enough to say, I need to tell you this, and that he acted on it in exactly the way he should have, is, I think, exemplary in terms of reinforcing that trust. And it's a microcosm of what we need to be doing as companies and as boards to all of the parties, the stakeholders who rely on us in the boardroom to be the representatives and the embodiment of that, those principles, of those ethical principles, and the principle of accountability and transparency.
Thanks, Karina, because we really do need society to trust our organizations, that they have the long-term planet and prosperity and people in mind when they're making these decisions. So we have run out of time, and I would love to have a whole afternoon with everyone online, but we are already 3 minutes over time. So I'd like to thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Both our attendees. Karina, thank you for joining us. Thanks, Prof. King, again for joining us. Thank you, Peter. It's been really wonderful having everybody online. And we look forward to the summaries that are going to be on the event page after this, after we've closed. So thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for the great questions, everyone.